Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. Today on the show, we have Daniel Shaw. Dan Shaw is a psychotherapist practicing in New York City, and he specializes in psychoanalysis, having trained with leaders in the relational psychoanalytic school. Dan also studied sensory motor psychotherapy and is certified in trauma-informed stabilization treatment. He works with adults to overcome obstacles in their personal and professional lives, focusing on narcissistic abuse and cult survivor recovery. Previously an actor and a missionary, Dan left a cultic organization in 1994 and became a mental health professional. He's a faculty member at the National Institute for Psychotherapies and the author of Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation, as well as Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery, which introduced traumatic narcissism theory to the field, a subject we will cover in depth in the second of our two discussions. Dan is a recipient of the Margaret Singer Award from the International Cultic Studies Association for his work on coercive persuasion and undue influence. Here is my friend and colleague, Dan Shaw. It is my pleasure to have Dan Shaw with me today to speak with me, to speak with you. And I want to make sure to mention also that he is back by popular demand. There were a number of people who were saying to me that we've kind of moved away from the topic of narcissism, even though it is woven into most of the episodes that we do, in small part because we're often talking about that personality that has caused the kind of damage that people are talking about in their episodes. But it's been tangential and we haven't dug into it since really the last couple episodes with Dan. And there was a request to have him back on to talk more about it, to reinforce some of the messages and also share if there was new data. And so I contacted you, Dan, and you wonderfully said, yes, please, and that you have more to share. So welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rachel. I always enjoy seeing you. As I mentioned, you're probably one of the very first people I met when I first left Siddha Yoga in 1994, because you worked then at the Jewish Board in Manhattan, which is near where my office was, and there you were. So it's always fun to get back in touch. Well, yeah, so it's always a pleasure getting to talk to you, and I am very grateful to these people who asked to have me back. That's really nice. So good to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice. And some people also have purchased your books, and it really spurred their interest in wanting to know more. And it's so nice, I think, to be able to hear someone speak and know that they've put out other materials so that you can go check it out. And so I know people have certainly done that. And in the show notes for this episode, there will be links to your books so far. And I know that, you're a prolific writer. So there will be more books in the future, and we can talk about that.
Yeah. I'm working on a final statement about traumatic narcissism. It's going to be part of a series of shorter books that are introductory to psychoanalytic topics. And it's going to be 40,000 words total. So it's just going to be called The Traumatic Narcissism Theory. And I'll get to be able to update and condense the information. And that's some of what I'll be telling you about today. I've got some updated, condensed info to share.
That's incredible. Incredible. Okay, so if it's okay with you, if we spend just a few moments for people who might not have heard you speak yet, even though I'm hoping that they will check out your previous episodes. In fact, you know what? I'll link those too in the show notes so people can go back and check. But if you can spend a few moments just letting people know who are not as familiar with you, what brings you into your interest in traumatic narcissism?
So I left this group, City Yoga, in 1994. I'd been fully committed and living and working full time within the community since the early 80s. I moved out of the ashram in the beginning of the 90s. I was still a follower until I left in 94. When I left, I had already gotten a new life together because I was no longer living in the ashram and I was going to grad school to become a psychotherapist. So literally, I left the cult because of further information about further abuses and corruption that I learned. And then in advance of the New Yorker magazine expose that came out in November 94. So learning about that, I left. I finally cut my ties and literally started my MSW grad school program like the same week, practically. So, I was thinking a lot about what the hell happened. I was talking to others who left City Yoga, who lived around where I lived in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And sort of a year after I left, it just dawned on me, I got to do something. I can't just pretend this never happened. So I wrote something called the open letter, and it's online still. If you Google open letter about City Yoga, I look back at that now, and I was formulating very clearly the things that were corrupt and abusive about the cult. And so when it came time to have to write I surprised myself that I was able to put my thoughts together coherently back then because I was pretty freshly out of it. But grad school was such a stimulating environment, So I was getting my mind back because when I left that cult, I literally lost the ability to speak. I couldn't put sentences together for a while. I had so many panic attacks for a while when I first left. So I was getting my mind back, my voice back. I write this open letter, and then it comes time to write a final paper for the degree. And I said, all right, I'm going to write about cults. And that just turned into an exploration of narcissism, which I had first read about because of a supervisor at an internship who said, why don't you read Alice Miller's book, Drama of the Gifted Child? And why don't you read Kohut's book, How Does Analysis Cure? That's a psychoanalytic book. So Alice Miller's talking about narcissistic parents who use their children as extensions of themselves and don't provide room for that person to be who they are or become who they are, which certainly fit my experience in the cult. And Kohut's talking about empathy, and I realized, I've been in a relationship with a guru who literally has no empathy, who is contemptuous of everyone. And when she does show concern or humanity or compassion, it's always just like mixed right in there with all the contempt and all the maltreatment. So I was turned on to the idea of the guru as a narcissist. And this is how I got involved with the literature of Erich Fromm, who wrote about this in terms of watching Hitler's rise in Germany. He was the main influence, I have to say, although many others have influenced me. His ideas about narcissism made the most sense to me. And so that was 94 when I wrote that. And then 10 years later, I published the book Traumatic Narcissism, because from that point, when I first wrote that grad school paper, and I then went into analytic training, I just was figuring this out to myself more and more. Basically because, I think like a lot of people who get out of an abusive relationship, whether it be a cult or a one-on-one, whatever it is, I was just astonished what happened to me? How did this happen to me? What? I was just like astonished, and I needed to figure it out. And I'll just say this last piece about this, Rachel. I know I'm taking forever to answer this question, but well, for me, it was easy to figure out what happened to me, why I was vulnerable. Why did I let myself get into this? I needed a place to find community and purpose, and I was very up against it at the end of my 20s, feeling like I hadn't really launched in the way that I'd hoped, and nothing was going the way I'd hoped. And this came along, and it just felt like I was going to have everything I was looking for that I was struggling to have. A purpose, meaning, community. So it wasn't so hard to figure out, oh, well, the reason I didn't have those things was because I had these problems and I was from this kind of a situation. And, it wasn't rocket science to figure it out. What was really confusing and strange and hard to figure out was, how does anybody behave the way this guru behaved? How could a human being possibly be that selfish and that cruel and that crazy and that charismatic? And those were the questions I thought were more interesting than what was my neurotic, psychoanalytic profile that led me into it. So that's how I really got into it.
It's incredible. I'm taking notes while you're talking. I think it is so important to look at that here we can talk about what the draw was for you, but also that, which all of it makes sense in terms of the purpose and community and meaning and a path to follow, all of it.
Yeah, and feeling like your love is going somewhere worthwhile, and then it's being returned. I mean, that's the real bait of these relationships and these cults. You're led to believe that you're really going to be giving your love in a worthwhile way and getting it returned, right? And of course, that's not what's happening.
No, and it is chill. I mean, the fact that your experiences then led you into your exposure to a kind of personality that I think is chilling. I think it's very hard for people when they suddenly realize that they're with someone who doesn't have the capacity to care. And what that means that they're capable of, without having remorse, without having this internal locus of control that guides them in any way, and that you really are on your own here and anything can happen. And the system itself is going to be set up so that you're blamed for it or you blame yourself for it. So it's all wrapped up so perfectly, unfortunately. But I know a couple of times when I've met a few people who are cult leaders, just on a few occasions. There is something where you almost feel like you have to get it off of you. Like you've been exposed to evil. You've been exposed to this chilling coldness. And I felt like taking a shower. I think it is very hard when you suddenly see that someone operates in the world in a very different way than you do, in a very different way than most people do. And you're lucky to have gotten out, even with the damage that was done.
Yeah.
Without.
Well, now I believe I have very good antenna, very good radar for who is full of it, who is bogus, who's seductive in an exploitive way or controlling way, which I didn't have then. I didn't, I wasn't as experienced as I might have been. I hadn't the maturity or something, whatever. But a lot of people in their 20s haven't been exposed to these kind of operators who are so good at persuading you that, well, not just people in their 20s, people in their 30s, 40s, etc., are vulnerable to these people who persuade you that they literally they are seeing in you something nobody's ever seen in you. They have something to give nobody's ever been able to give. You can be very swept away by that. I was. And it was in a big community. It wasn't like a one-on-one where, I see many people in my psychotherapy practice where this is happening to them one-on-one. But it's the exact same dynamic as a cult. So the idea of the traumatizing narcissist tries to get at who this person is and why do they behave the way they do, and what can we understand about that helps us either free ourselves or avoid it altogether.
Right, right. Okay, so before we get into your exciting new research, and it's hard for me to even say before we do that because I'm dying to hear it, but I do feel like just in terms of the steps moving forward in terms of the chronology, you just mentioned that you have a good antenna now, and I think people hearing that are going to wonder what you notice and what you feel you need to notice to kind of keep yourself safer. So what alerts you now to the fact that you're dealing with this kind of personality?
It's I wish I could be, maybe that's what I'll have to be thinking about more clearly, because it's really a certain sensibility. But all right, I just thought of a situation where I was at a social event and there was this lovely attractive yoga teacher, and she seemed very friendly and nice and so on. And she had this boyfriend who was a lawyer, and he was a big, handsome guy, a little older, very suave, right? And the guy creeped me out so bad. First of all, he was handsy. He was like massaging your shoulder. And he was so like open and friendly and sensitive and in your space, but all about how he's like this healer, prophet kind of person. And it wasn't even he saying these things explicitly, but the energy of this, I am this wise person who can, heal your chakras. Or it doesn't have to even be new age or spiritual, but it's just an energy of seductiveness, and that which doesn't have to be exactly sexual, but it sort of is. It can be overtly in some cases, but he wasn't being overtly sexualizing. He was just being like seductive in terms of, look at what an amazing person I am, and so are you, and why don't we have this conversation? And it's just like such a bunch of bull. And so basically, these people, when they're going to be like this, they act as though they're magical and you're magical. And maybe that's the way to sum it up, is that I am just so allergic to any kind of magical thinking now. And I like things that are grounded and practical and simple and real. And when people come at you with magical thinking, they're not real. And there's an agenda around making boundaries go away. And I like boundaries. We protect each other with our boundaries. We protect ourselves from dysregulation. We protect others, Certainly professionally, it's so important, but interpersonally, it's also important. So I hope that makes sense.
Oh, it does. And I'm now remembering, I have a really good friend from elementary school, and he always had issues with his own dad, who always looked very slick, also had perpetual tan skin, which was always odd to me. And he was also handsy. And it was so creepy. Ugh. And I know my friend would sometimes say, and it would mean that he would get yelled at later and berated and blamed for shaming, but he would often say, "Dad, hands down." Like, because his dad would come up from behind me and massage my shoulders, play with my hair. I thought, stop that. That's gross. I mean, at the time of whatever, I was 8, but then I was 13, 15, and I just never wanted to go over there because, but there is this pushing through that fourth wall, or just the boundary, no one is asking, can I touch your body? And I wonder how much of that is just not knowing what's okay or testing to see how much you'll be okay with, how much they can get away with.
Well, yeah, and listen, even when it's not like creepy sexualized, the the presentation of a person who basically tells you in one way or another, whether it's a guru or anybody, I am a person who needs no boundaries. I see it all. I know it all. I am boundless, and you can join my boundaryless, boundless, and infinite world. It's a magical thinking, unboundaried kind of energy that is a terrible red flag not to catch. You don't want to miss that one.
Right. Right. And you almost feel safer at times with people who are awkward for this reason. Right.
Yeah. Well, at least you have a chance to get to know each other with some boundaries in place before you feel like you want to get to know each other better.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's when the boundaries aren't there from the get-go, that's
That's
dangerous.
right. Yeah. So, and I think it's so much about a power play in those moments too, right? Which is also very uncomfortable. Ugh, ugh. So, all right. So that is very interesting. And I think the seduction that you're talking about that's non-sexual, I see something special in you and I can offer you something special. That is something that is all too intoxicating, I think. And that's why so many of these people either get away with it or they just make millions off of some product. And sometimes the product is them.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and of course, I'm sure you you saw this too. During the pandemic, this just became like a avalanche or a volcano of endlessly erupting new influencers, shamans, gurus, coaches, everything from new age to fitness to vitamins to beauty to whatever it was. The amount of people who wanted to sell themselves as a guru of one sort or another and create followers. It just was mushrooming because everybody was scared and everybody was glued to their screens and nobody knew what was happening next. And somebody looks like they know what's going on and it's very appealing. I mean, that's another thing about the narcissist. They seem so sure of themselves. They seem so confident and self-assured, and they feel it seems like they know how to handle everything, and that can be very appealing. If you're at all insecure, and that's the thing. Everybody's insecure. That's not necessarily a bad thing about us. Our insecurities are, if they don't take over, they give us a chance to not go too quickly. And when you meet somebody who shows no sign of insecurity, that's another red flag.
So when you're talking about kind of going quickly and having your boundaries kind of keep you, I think, at a certain pace where you can modulate, you can see who this person is, who you should trust or not. But you need more information first, right? You're going to wait and see how you feel. I mean, it's part of the reason that when I was talking to someone, they were saying, what do you not do when you're doing therapy? Like, what you won't like sit next to the person on the couch, right? You give them some space. And I said, I don't use the words resistance or withholding, ever, because there's a reason. If someone doesn't want to share information with you, honor that. And maybe they need to know more about your trustworthiness first. Maybe they have been so burned in the past that it's a really good boundary setting. And that if someone is resisting, it's like you're saying, my feelings are being hurt by you saying no or wait. But then how is that different from the people who crossed their boundaries in the past? So I'm careful not to blame people for saying, hold that thought, let's wait. And I can meet them there.
Well, for people who say no, what if they were raised in a family where saying no was a crime and you had to be punished for saying no? So you weren't allowed to have boundaries. What if you were in a relationship where where you're forced to into coerced, I should say, sometimes very subtly coerced into compliance, and you lose the right, you feel like you have no right to say no. So when you go to a therapist and the therapist doesn't want you to say no and then you start pathologizing that, that's not a good sign. So I love that you were thinking in that direction, because I really agree. It's important to respect that people are going to need to you're going to need to help people trust you, and and it's not going to happen through seduction or shaming them about some resistance or whatever. It's going to happen, mutually through a collaboration while everybody's consensually agreeing to,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and before launching into your research, there's something else you mentioned that I want to come back to just briefly, which is this idea of not being able to put a sentence together. Because I've noticed, and this is something that I know I've talked about in support groups, where people apologize for having trouble getting to the point, or that there are these pregnant pauses, and they worry they're coming across as not being on top of their game, not knowing what they're talking about, and or taking up someone else's time by taking a long time to get to the point. And I've sometimes asked people, how about, for the purpose of this group, instead of the silence, you narrate what is happening in your head. So the questions that you've been told to ask yourself about if this is important, or if you're making it up, if you're being dramatic, if you're trying to get attention, all the things that sometimes a narcissist will redirect onto you. And what else is making you, or were you berated for bringing up things and called stupid? What's happening? So we understand that you're just not taking a pause. You're incredibly busy sifting through all of these doubts and questions. Let us know what they are. Maybe we can help with those. And I'm wondering, for you, when you came out, and maybe it's hard, this has been a while, but right? I mean, it's hard. And sometimes it's good that you can't remember, which means time has passed and you've moved on, which is lovely. But what do you think was getting in the way of you putting a sentence together, as bright as you are and as good with words as you are?
Look, towards the last 6 months of living in the ashram, that last year I had begun getting elevated into being in charge of 8 million departments. And then one evening, and then I started having more and more contact with the guru, smaller and smaller groups, private, all the things that you want as a follower of a guru is to get close to the guru. So I was getting there. And then I was in a small group, and Guru Maya was totally wailing on one of the people in the community, as she typically did. She was so contemptuous and disparaging of everybody behind their back and sometimes right to their face, right? And so she was really just, cutting somebody to shreds. And I had the temerity to say, yeah, but, he's so devoted. And she looked at me like, well, if you've ever seen Disney's Alice in Wonderland, when Alice goes through the looking glass into the world of the Red Queen, and the Red Queen is screaming, "Off with her head!" So I got the off with his head look, and from that moment on, day in and day out, she made sure to find ways to publicly and privately humiliate me and shame me to death. So literally by the time she was ready to say, okay, it's time for you to move out and go get a therapist, that's when I couldn't speak. And it took months and months to regain any sort of stability. I had such bad social phobia. And, this happens to a lot of the people who come into my practice who've just gotten out of a relationship, usually with an individual, but often with a group, a cult, where they are just like sort of broken and they feel like they have no confidence in what they're saying or doing or thinking. And these are often people who are extremely intelligent and competent. That's what happens in these relationships. So it took me quite a while to recover my stamina and my ability to feel like I could have any confidence in my own thoughts, my own words. And then finally, I still hadn't quite left when this happened. I was in therapy and he was very nice. I wouldn't say he was the most knowledgeable. He certainly really didn't understand cults or this kind of narcissism, this kind of abuse as fully as he might have, but he was very kind. That was good. And one day I had the courage to say out loud, my guru is really cruel. And that, to me, looking back, marks the beginning of reclaiming my own voice, my own mind, my own thoughts, right? Words. And his reaction was, "Oh, you mean tough love?" And I was like, no, I'm not talking about that. I mean cruelty. And he was like, "Oh." And then that conversation was allowed to happen. So this is true for so many of the people that I see, as I've said, who have been traumatized in these ways. So much of the work is about helping people regain faith in themselves, trust in themselves, self-respect, self-esteem, their own dignity. All of that's been taken when you're abused by a narcissist.
So many people are also left carrying guilt and shame, and even though they didn't do this to themselves, but just the person who did do it to you, it has moved on. And they are not working in past tense, I think, most of the time.
Their whole life is invested in believing that they have no reason to be ashamed of anything. That's a good thing to notice. If a person seems to present themselves as having no reason to be ashamed ever of anything, if you get involved with that person, you're going to end up carrying 10 times more shame than you ever thought you needed to have, because you're holding all of theirs for them. The shame that they refuse to acknowledge or admit to,
Wow. Incredible. Okay. All right. So now moving into what you've been studying, and I feel honored that you want to share it with me and with us.
I really appreciate the opportunity. And we're talking about it in a good way to segue right into it. Why don't I lay some of this out and then, interrupt whenever you feel like there's a question. But I want to just start by trying to explain who is what I call a traumatizing narcissist. Now, I haven't trademarked that phrase, but it's mine. It wasn't happening until I used it. And in fact, it took me a while to come up with it. I was thinking destructive narcissist. I didn't like pathological narcissist because the term is very loose and it means too many different things. And that's how I felt about it. And what I wanted to describe was a particular kind of narcissist, more like what people say when they mean a malignant narcissist or a messianic narcissist. All right, so the traumatizing narcissist. I'm actually going to read you a little.
Yeah, please do. And for anyone listening too, if you use the phrase to put it in quotes and Daniel Shaw next to it, because
I bequeath it to the world. It's yours now.
Nice. Right. Well, okay, that's nice of you. Yes, but I want to honor that it was your creation.
And Rachel, if you recall, when we first entered the cult world, and this is a little tangent, but I was in it a little after you were already in the ex-cult world when I got into it. And back then, we were talking about cult leaders as sociopaths, as having, undue influence and stuff like that. But we weren't really talking about narcissism that much. And so when I introduced narcissism at a conference at the International Cultic Studies, I feel like that finally lit up. Everybody was like, yes, it's not just about sociopathy or psychopaths. It's not just about mesmerizing charismatics. These people are narcissistic. And that means I'm going to say what I mean by it when I call them traumatizing narcissists. I'll go right into it. All right. So the main thing that I think is important to understand is that a traumatizing narcissist is a delusional person. What are they delusional about? They have a delusion of omnipotence. They honestly have this delusional belief that they are infinitely superior people. And that superiority, they believe, is what makes them infinitely entitled. So that's the first thing. If you think you have no cause to ever have any kind of shame because you are a superior person with superior entitlement, then you're delusional. And it's a delusion of omnipotence. So I can't stress that enough, because then everything makes sense once you just put it that way. And of course, these people look like normal people. They talk, they function, they make money, they have all kinds of interesting lives. Maybe they're artists, maybe they're professionals, this kind of that. They're not just new age charlatan grifters. They're often people doing quite well. But that's the common thread, this delusion of omnipotence. So the thing about that delusion is it's very unstable, because delusions are unstable. They're like a dam. All right. So a dam is holding back stuff, right? And if what it's holding back is intense, the dam gets these cracks. Well, the delusion of omnipotence is a dam that holds back everything this person is pretending not to be or feel. It holds back their shame, their smallness, their impotence, their weakness. It holds back their fear. So everything they don't want to believe is true of who they are, they want to believe they've transcended all of those things. That dam, that delusion of omnipotence is standing in front of all of that stuff, all the insecurity and fear and shame. And since it's always like pressing against the dam is always springing leaks or cracks. How do they plug the leaks? By controlling other people. If I can prove to myself that I have the power to control you, to subjugate you, to make you adore me, to make you do whatever I want, to make you give me whatever I want you to give me. If I have that power, then I prove that I'm not weak, I'm not impotent, I'm not small, I'm not needy, and I don't have to feel ashamed of anything. So the problem is this delusion that you're none of those things is so unstable that you have to prove over and over and over that you are omnipotent, you are so powerful, you are so superior. I just think if you look at the debate that happened recently with Trump and Madam Vice President, I mean, she says to him, people leave your rallies. And then what happens? He starts going, they're eating the pets. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cat. I mean, he literally went out of his mind when she said to him, they're leaving your rallies. They get bored listening to you. He literally lost his mind and somehow has to regain all of this power that he thinks he has. And the way he does it is by saying they're eating the pets, right? By trying to regain control by terrifying people and getting them to hate other people. Okay. So I don't want to talk too much about him, but he really does provide us a public example of this stuff. So that delusion, they're always trying not to feel the impotence by holding the delusion of omnipotence, right? But the thing is that anybody who doesn't join this delusion, that person is a threat. This is why he doesn't want to debate Kamala Harris, because she threatens this delusion of omnipotence by saying people leave your rallies. I mean, think about it. Or when Obama made fun of him, or when Obama in the convention did the joke about the crowd size. I mean, this confronts this person's delusion of omnipotence. You're just a person. You have problems, dude. You have flaws. No, you know. So if you're not submitting to the traumatizing narcissist, you're threatening him or her. And so as long as there is this other person, an individual, a family, a cult, a nation, as long as you got enough people to join your delusion, you can hold on to it. But it's always being threatened by people who are not joining it, who don't submit. And those are the people that have to be destroyed. So once you get somebody, an individual or a group or a family or a nation or whatever kind of community, once you get enough submission, you got to hold on to that, because that's what's holding up your delusion, your delusional omnipotence. So to hold on to everybody's submission, you have to keep upping the ante and moving the goalposts. People are never doing enough, giving enough, loving enough, giving enough money. You've got to keep your followers or the individual you've subjugated. You got to keep them afraid, insecure, ashamed, dependent. They have to believe that you're always trying to elevate them by pointing out what's wrong with them. Only by pointing out what's wrong with other people, by looking down on people, by seeing other people as impotent and weak and dependent, can you hold on to your delusion that I'm none of those things. I'm superior to all of those things. So to me, that's the essence of the traumatizing narcissist and what he's about. For my hope in creating these ideas about what this person's psychology is, because Rachel, they don't come into our office and ask us to help them. They come in, and the minute you disagree with them, they tell you you're a lousy therapist, and they leave and they don't pay you. So we can't examine them. We can't. So I have to theorize about what's going on. And that's what I've observed. That's what I believe. And, knowing that is my hope is that people who understand this about that kind of person are able to loosen the grip that person has on them. They're able to emancipate themselves from being controlled and subjugated when they know that there's no there, when they know that, the man behind the curtain is just, a doddering old fool, not the Wizard of Oz.
Right. And okay, wow. All right. I have so many questions. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is wonderful. But okay. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just what happens over time as these people age. Is there a shift over time? Does something change? Also, what happens if you're with a narcissist and they say, I'm going to come with you to therapy? And, or if you as a therapist notice this, because, right, we can sort of pick up this, something's off and it's not going to work out. What happens in the sort of the therapeutic realm? And also, I know that this kind of personality, the traumatizing narcissist, TM, Daniel Shaw, is somebody also who comes into that for certain reasons. And that's not an excuse, and it's not to give them a pass, but to understand where that might come from. So we can go a lot of different directions.
I'll start with the last point. I have a fairly simple or streamlined way of thinking about how did they get this way, which is that, they grow up in some way as young people where they are, they feel they feel too much shame and humiliation. So maybe they're treated badly in their families. Maybe they're treated badly in their school by peers. Maybe they're bullied. maybe they're just left feeling very angry and hurt and resentful about the being mistreated and being made to feel small. And it's out of this having been made to feel small that instead of becoming more and more depressed, which means that you have the potential to heal your wounds, instead of that, they become manic and they become manically grandiose. And sort of in this like personal transformation, they become these, perfectly superior people. And if you look at the biographies of a lot of people like this, you notice they often describe a period in their sort of middle school, adolescent part of their life when everything falls apart, when they lose, where they have a nervous breakdown, or maybe as a young adult. There's some major event of total like collapse after which they resurrect themselves in this completely, new and improved way as these, magical people who are now going to turn around and tell everybody else how to evolve, how to heal, how to be transcendent, etc. Right? I don't want to name all the names of all the gurus whose profile that fits, but they're all. It's if you look into it, they're there, and certainly I've seen that in the history of people who my patients will talk to me about. They'll talk to me about their dad or their ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or somebody. And when we discover the history, we find out, oh yeah, they were like a schlemiel, they were a nobody, they felt crappy about themselves, and then they had this amazing transformation. So I think it's the antidote to being profoundly ashamed and humiliated that you flip it. You just become totally shameless. That's the answer to the one part of your question.
So there are these three different points that I was thinking about, and there are many more, I'm sure. But yes, the last one about sort of what makes them tick, why they create into this sort of this adaptation, right? And then it was about what happens if they're brought to therapy, or they're sitting across from you, or you are with someone who says, we need to go to therapy. We need to go to therapy together. And it needs to be someone I find also. Usually that's the case.
Yeah. What you're describing happens all the time. And the minute the narcissist comes into the therapy is over, because the therapist who has, any skill is going to say, well, how are you contributing to the problem? And their answer is not in any way or shape or form. It's all this other person. And when you say that's probably impossible to be in a relationship where only one person has any responsibility for what's going wrong, and at that point, they don't want to be in therapy with you, they fire you. I was once working with a guy for a while. His wife apparently found out who I was and where my office was. And in the middle of his session, there's a pounding on the door. And there she is outside the door trying to get in to tell me why everything he's telling me is a lie. So, people will go to great lengths to stop the person they're holding on to from growing or having any kind of therapy that helps them feel stronger and perhaps then better able to actually leave the relationship. It speaks to how desperately needy the traumatizing narcissist actually is. I've often said that gurus are the neediest people in the world. They act as though they absolutely don't need anybody or anything. And what you realize is that they are more needy than anybody ever. And every second of the day, somebody has to be waiting on them hand and foot. Or if they're a sexual predator, they have to have, 10,000 conquests among the followers available at all times, day and night. And that's in cults. And with other people, it's just like, they present themselves as the strongest and most powerful person in the family, let's say. And meanwhile, everybody has to walk on eggshells constantly all the time around them and wait on them hand and foot and, not dare to cross them or be disinherited. This is incredible neediness that is another important thing for people to understand when they feel trapped and held captive in these relationships. That person's a hell of a lot more needy than you. They've just talked you into believing otherwise,
Right. And they would let you have it if you were to quote unquote accuse them of that or just
Oh,
pinpoint
boy.
it. Right.
Oh, yeah.
But I wonder also just about the sort of internal space that doesn't hold on to all the compliments from yesterday, the conquests from yesterday.
Right,
But it's like
right.
there's like a sieve, right? All these things it dissipates, goes up in the air. And I think that's why people in that vortex of that narcissist are exhausted and they have to prove over and over again. And I wonder what that is about, that they don't have this sort of solid receptacle inside where they can hold on to the fact that they matter, really.
Well, I would answer that this way. If you have had to develop a delusion of omnipotence in order to solve your problems of feeling impotent and small, then that delusion cannot hold, and you're going to have to keep proving it over and over and over. So whoever you're getting to prove that you're omnipotent is going to be exhausted because it's never going to be enough. In these relationships, in these groups, nobody can ever love enough, give enough. You're always being accused of failing to love enough or give enough because this person is inexhaustibly needy. They need endless confirmation that their delusion of their own omnipotence is not a delusion, that they're not needy, not weak, not dependent. And to confirm that, they have to get other people to just like never stop desperately trying to, give more. And as long as they have those people, they can, drain the last drop out of them. It's like Dracula, it's like, I don't have a life unless I suck your blood. And then I can leave, if I leave my coffin and I'm going to have a life at night, I need to suck the blood out of you in order for that to happen. And that's what you're doing within these relationships, I want to speak to also what you brought up, which is what happens as they get older to these people. They are so uh, resentful of time and age and death and mortality. It's like such an insult. The delusion of omnipotence says I'm immortal. I am always the powerful one. And death and age and illness or any of those things are just like so insulting, so and such a threat. As people catch on to them, and start to not be so afraid of them and not walk on eggshells around them and not give a shit if they get disinherited or whatever it is, they're losing their grip, they're losing their control, and they just get meaner and crazier, basically. I've seen this, or I've heard it described. I've also seen it, that, these people become increasingly resentful of everybody. They highlight how nobody ever gave us enough or loved enough or was loyal or faithful enough or submissive enough. That becomes their daily, life's breath is the resentment, because they're losing their grip, they're losing their control, right? Often they die very, very alone and very angry. Very alone, very angry. Nobody ever appreciated, how great I was. You just see this kind of, it's not tragic. Tragedy is when somebody had, well, it might be tragic. Let me put it this way. The reason people fall under the spell of these kinds of people is there is something that you feel and you see that has to do with something, some kind of specialness, some kind of love, something special. And so that makes such a huge impression that you then talk yourself into overlooking all the cruelty and all the selfishness. And so when these people die and they've never overcome their cruelty or their selfishness, it can be very sad because for those who survived, because there was something there that could have developed that never did. Some kind of unselfishness, some kind of love that could have developed and it never did. So in that sense, it's sad when they go out angry and contemptuous and resentful, because they could have loved. They could have let people, they could have been loved and they could have given love. And they've never developed.
It is an incredible thing just to feel, I feel that emptiness as you're talking. It's very empty. And I just wonder about the whole self-protective piece, that if they were to develop real love, would there be this sort of tied in with this fear of absolute destruction? If you leave yourself open, if you put your heart in someone else's hands.
Totally. There's that decision at that point when they transform themselves into the incredible superior Hulk personality after they've been so hurt, wounded, humiliated, deflated, which is like, I'm never going to be vulnerable. People are going to be vulnerable to me, but I'm not going to be vulnerable to them. There's that determination, which is, can become truly horrifying. Like, everybody during the pandemic watched The Vow about Keith Raniere and Nixium, right? It's a great example of the incredible neediness of a person who figures out how to make everybody else feel like they're the needy one. And then has the power to then persuade them to submit themselves further and further and deeper, in his case, to the point of being willingly calling yourself a slave and trying to recruit others to be slaves as well. It's an amazing power to have, that you take your own impotence and mask it to yourself and others so well that, you get intelligent, attractive, successful people to submit themselves to you. But, as we saw with Raniere and as we see with many of the cult leaders, they don't last. Some of them have committed suicide. Some of them have committed murder-suicides. Some of them have gone fully psychotic. You can't sustain this delusion of omnipotence. It has an arc. You get to a certain point, and then you start going insane. And then people start seeing through you or not being intimidated of you. And then things start to collapse.
It's so interesting, too, because I guess you've worked so hard, or they worked so hard to perfect this skill set. And suddenly when it's not working anymore, what else do they have? I'm sure that just adds to this despair.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But, they're always going to try to package it as I won. I mean, again, the week after the debate with Kamala Harris, Trump is going around saying, everybody's saying I won that debate. No, nobody was saying that. Nobody said that. Nobody.
No.
But you're going to package it the way you need to package it.
And you just wonder when he's talking this way or anyone's talking this way. I won and giving all of these statistics that don't add up to 100, which was interesting. There was
Yeah.
I never quite understood. Like, well, that's 87% of what? And you just left out, you just made up things. And
It's true.
right? Exactly. Like 74% thought I won and 9% thought I did. Like, okay, that's not how that works.
Doesn't add up.
No. But I think what's interesting too is that you wonder why other people don't have this response that you might have or that I might have, which is, oh, that's just so childlike. Oh, that's just sad. Just stop. Just, but I think some people are persuaded by that potentially.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, look, I was in it until I wasn't. And I don't know what would have pulled me out of my cult worship of a traumatizing narcissist, a malignant narcissist, I would say. I don't know what would have pulled me out before I got out. But when I got out, it was because that was when I got out. I don't know how else to put it. It's like when you're in it, you don't want to have to admit that everything you thought and felt was wrong. So you try to keep justifying and validating that you aren't wrong. Some people can keep doing that forever and ever. But at some point, look at all the Republicans, by the way, who are, all trying to publicly state we're not going to support him. We're voting for Harris. And I'm sorry if this offends anybody politically, but it's there. I can't not talk about it. It's the most public example of what it is to be a narcissist and what that looks like and what happens. And, people leave, but there's still so many, most of the whole House of Representatives on the Republican side, who are going to go down and die for this man, who are literally going to give their lives, as the January 6th coup people were. We're going to give our life for him. I was ready to take a bullet for my guru while I was in that cult, if that ever happened. So when you're in it, it's very hard to come out. And usually, I guess maybe that I could ask you, Rachel, what happens for people that finally helps them decide I got to get out of this? You work with this all the time, right?
I think that when people are faced with these sorts of things where there is often this sort of either a slow burn, like they're starting to notice and they can't not notice anymore. And now once they've kind of opened themselves up to that possibility that the leader isn't perfect in these ways, I think it becomes a bit like a house of cards and you start seeing other things too. And it's important, I think, even if I'm doing an intervention, which I don't do as often as doing counseling, but even if it seems like it didn't quote unquote work, because people go back, then they can see what we were talking about, but with their own eyes, which I think a lovely and respectful way to do it. Like you need to come to it on your own, but here's something to watch out for.
Yeah. It was that way for me, by the way. 5 years, I would say, of slowly trying to put together, why does this feel so bad? Why am I so unhappy? Why is this behavior? Why am I seeing this kind of behavior? How do I put this? And after a while, you just can't keep justifying things that are unjustifiable. If you're lucky, I guess you're lucky if you start to see the truth. And some people never get there, but maybe that's the best way. The most we can say is that people who figure it out and start leaving are the lucky ones.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you've been lucky enough, talking about lucky ones, if you've been lucky enough to not be faced with someone with this personality before, you don't know what you're dealing with at all. And if it's so contrary to your wiring, you really don't know what you're dealing with because you can fill in the blanks of the information, assuming someone has similar intentions that you might to someone, or that their ability, their way for interacting is genuinely for someone else's gain, because that's why you might behave that way towards someone. So I think as soon as people start to see that someone else is very different, it can really affect them, kind of infect them. Like, oh, who have I been in such close contact with? Who have I let access me and decide for me in these ways? Who really are they? I think also people sometimes will think about leaving not because something happened to them, but because something happened to someone else, right? That they witnessed, that they had to not protect them from, or that they were guided to treat their children in a certain way because the guru said. And so I think that, I mean, unfortunately, then you get into the realm of moral injury, right? A lot of people now are talking about this idea of coming out, having either participated or quote unquote let something happen, even though that really, all this language doesn't apply to these situations.
So just to bring it to the microcosm in a family, let's say the patriarch is abusive and the wife has had to enable him at the expense of the children, and the wife finally wakes up and says, I can't let my children be treated this way anymore. Or it could be gender reversed, or any gender, right? But what you're describing, I think, is very true, that often people leave these relationships or these groups because they finally can't tolerate what's happening to somebody else, even if they tolerated it happening to them.
Right. Yeah. Or they really now know what the guru is, and it's still their job to recruit new members. And they're realizing they're at odds with themselves suddenly with doing that. And what does that mean? So I'm wondering also, just as we're finishing up, people will sometimes ask me, I have so much anger about what happened. I have so much resentment, but I know that I can't go yell at the guru. Sometimes they're not around anymore. But also they know how deeply unsatisfying that will be. And so what do you do with, and how do you help yourself? Just, I think if you wanted to share that from your own experience, or helping other people too, who are left with the anger and the resentment.
Yeah. Well, in whatever way possible, whether it's writing, whether it's therapy, whether it's support groups, or whether it's just, a very interested, caring friend, whatever it is, you try to get your story together. You try to, we call it in attachment theory, a coherent narrative. You try to get your story more and more clear, more and more coherent. Try to be able to articulate for yourself, and possibly for others, this is what happened. This is how I understand it. This is really important. And like I say, there's different ways that people can do this. Writing, therapy, support groups are some of the main ways I can think of right now. So if you're in a support group, you're hearing other people's stories, you're able to tell your own, you build and strengthen and make more and more coherent your own story. That helps. There are a lot of people, of course, who immediately want to become activists. You and I know this all too well. We've seen it a million times. I know people who've tried this and it blows up in your face. You get on TikTok now and you have 8 million followers, and then everybody starts getting on there and trashing you, and your whole TikTok collapses, or that kind of thing. You go out there trying to expose everything and you bankrupt yourself, or you really drive yourself insane. And this has happened to, a handful of people I know. And of course I know of many more. So when I left, I started trying to get my story together and articulate it. And I then participated in forums, and then we created a website. And the person who created the website tried to make it interactive, and then he burned out because everybody was telling him, flaming and trolling. And so that website still exists for the cult I left, leavingsiddhayoga.net. I have not been interactive in any way for 20 years on this website. It stands there as an archive for people to reference if they so desire. I don't promote it. But if you are getting into this particular group and you look it up on Google and you see that site, you'll read everything you need to know about why you shouldn't get into it. So it's hard to do that if it's just your ex-husband or your ex-wife or you don't make a website about, Sarah Shapiro is a narcissist. It's like a kind of a, misuse of your energy. But you do want to be able to have that narrative clear in your mind, at least in some form. So not to get revenge, not to be vindicated, but just for your own sake so that you feel like I can move on. I can invest myself in my life, my health, my strength, because this story is told, it's clear. I'm not confused. I know how to understand it. And I'm freeing up my energy to have a good, decent life going forward.
Okay. That's really, really powerful. Very powerful. And so in terms of having a good, decent life moving forward, I know that your life is a full one. And so where can people find what you do, or if they want to come to you for counseling, if they want to find out more about what you have in the works or what you've done before, where can people find you?
Thank you for that, Rachel. I'm at danielshaw.lcsw.com. And I have a Facebook author page. My personal page is where I put my Wordle scores and tell dad jokes. So don't try to friend me there. Just go to the author page, Daniel Shaw, LCSW on Facebook. And I list events and things that I'm interested in. I post there that are not just silliness, like the personal Facebook page. So yeah, those are the main ways.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas about the traumatizing narcissist and really making that important wording distinction, because I think people really need to understand that it is traumatizing, that it can impact you, not just in kind of an emotional way, like, oh, it's a drag. I was with someone who was controlling or whatever. It is deeper than that. It's physiological. And I think it's good for people to know that that's a possibility here, or to understand why they're having those after effects. And it's from that relationship.
Thank you for your work, all the good work you do.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, Rachel.
One more thing before you go. It is always, always, always a pleasure to talk to Dan Shaw. He's so kind and he's so smart, and you're going to be able to hear him again after this episode as well. What is really important about his story is how his experiences turned this light bulb on, where he had this idea that he wanted to figure out what made his guru tick, what made her do what she did, what was she about, how was she wired, how could she do these things. And that deep dive, that exploration has given us so much information, books, research that I'm so grateful for. I know so many of the listeners are grateful for. There are a number of things that Dan said that I want to highlight here. One of the words, though, that he used, every once in a while when I have someone speaking on the podcast, there's a word or a phrase that I can feel goes right through me. And I think, that's something I'm going to remember, and I want to talk about it. because I felt it. When he talked about his former guru, Guru Mai, he said that she had no empathy. She was selfish and cruel and charismatic. And this other C word that he used that I really felt. He said that she had contempt for people. And it seems like she had contempt for feeling and contempt for feelings, contempt for anyone who I guess was not her, contempt for anyone who was behaving in a way where she might be given some level of responsibility to care about them or to notice the consequence of her actions. And I think when that is treated with impatience, you certainly can feel it, you can see it. You see that in the partner or in the parent who says, come on, that's not worth crying about. Come on, stop. But that's impatience. And sometimes that's just not good parenting. But contempt, pure, unadulterated hatred, condescension, that's awful. And you don't know that that's what this person is feeling until it suddenly becomes clear. And then it's like being bathed in ice water. Like it shocks your system, I think. There is this idea that when a person has this much charisma and has it all together and is going to be so contemptuous of people who seem weak, that might mean that they have it all together. But as Dan said, the guru, the leader, the manipulator, the narcissistic partner, they're the neediest ones in that dyad. They're the neediest ones in that group. And the thing that's exhausting is that their neediness is unquenched. Their neediness is insatiable. And so they drain everyone around them and then are mad at the people around them for not giving them more, not doing more, when everyone is just exhausted from having already done more than should ever be expected of them, than is even humanly possible. There are so many people I've met who have been in these kinds of relationships, who have been in these kinds of groups, and so many of them are so lovely and well-meaning and devoted to ideas, to learning, to causes, to the embetterment of themselves, to the world, their fellow man and woman. And I've said this before, and I say it to a lot of clients, that if we could just sort of picture one of these sorts of cranes coming down, like in an arcade machine that's going to pluck a toy up out of a bin. And if a cult leader, a manipulative partner could just be plucked up and sent away, and the rest of the group, and I say that as a visual because they would not go willingly, the rest of the group is able just to exist on its own. It might have trouble if they have been convinced that they can't make a decision or they shouldn't make a decision without the leader's help. But eventually, I think people come back to learning that they can trust themselves or they can trust each other to a certain degree. And then there's a possibility that that religious organization or that commune, that self-help group, could actually be a place of real help, a place of healthy community. It's the leader who makes it unhealthy. It's the leader who orchestrates everything around them and their needs and pretends to care and pretends to give and pretends to teach and pretends to be the one who is sacrificing all for the followers. But they're sacrificing nothing. They just want you to feel indebted to them. So they often use that kind of language, that they're giving so much of themselves to you. But ultimately, they're giving nothing. And so I hope that the people who have left these kinds of communities, these kinds of relationships, can feel like they really are not the ones with the problem, even though a lot of former members are treated that way by their families, sometimes by the public, until people learn differently, until people really learn. But I think when people get involved in these groups, they're going based on the information they have, and the information seems just fine. And like a quote-unquote normal pursuit. Just like how Dan said that when he got in, he was looking for community and purpose and a path and meaning. And the harsh reality was that he was looking to be able to give his love to someone worthwhile and then get it in return. But that can be done in a performative way by a cult leader, but only for so long. And then you realize you're loving someone who's not able and not interested in giving it back. I'm so glad that Dan is free from all of that. And I'm so glad he had an interest in exploring all of this, so we benefit from it. Take good care. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.